I'm Cyndy Guerrero.
And I'm Tomas Guerrero.
And together we're bringing you voices from around the university
to talk about things that matter to you, our students.
This is RGVoces. For some more insight on today's topic, stay tuned after the first part of the podcast for a special interview with another voice from around the university. All right, guys, today we're going to talk about finding sources and how to use them effectively, okay? So, first of all, sources are articles or other material that you use to back up the information that you talk about in your research paper.
Right.
So people can know that you are a trustworthy voice in this conversation.
Right. Part of, walking into a conversation or a research is also kind of establishing why you are an authority on this topic. So if you come in and you just start saying, certain exclamations like, "Oh, this is this," and then people ask you, "Well, where did you find that from?" Or where did you learn that from? And then you go,
I made it up.
Yeah, I made it up. You lose authority over the conversation. But on the other hand, if you find sources, if you read up on things that are credible, now let me make sure I say that. If you find sources that are credible, and then therefore build upon those credible sources, you yourself become a credible source.
Right. And so when we talk about credible sources, we talk about peer-reviewed sources. Mm-hmm. And what peer-reviewed means is that an expert wrote this thing, and they went to other experts in their field, and they had them read it to make sure that the information was accurate.
Right.
And so it went through that whole process probably several times before it got published. So it's much more trustworthy than, say, anything you would find on Google.
Right.
And we'll talk about where to find those peer-reviewed sources later, but we do want to emphasize why they are important.
Right.
They're important because in our everyday life, we tend to get inundated with a lot of facts and a lot of claims. Mm-hmm. And there's a difference between the two.
Right.
So facts are things that we all agree upon to be true.
Right.
Like, I want to say the earth is round, but we don't even agree on that. And
not we as in the people
No,
talking.
no, God, no. Other people.
We as in a learned society.
Right.
The majority of us would agree that is a fact.
Right.
But there are certain people contributing to a conversation that shouldn't exist. But contributing to a conversation that puts doubt in people's minds and therefore kind of transforms whether that's actually a fact or not.
Right.
So when we say fact, we are defining something that we could all generally agree upon.
Right.
On a normal, not cloudy day, because I have some students who say that it's cloudy, we all agree that the sky is blue.
Right.
And that turns it into a fact.
Right.
And the interesting things about facts is that depending on the timing or the situation, certain things can be facts at one point and then they're just not.
Right.
At a certain point in our history, it was a fact that witches existed.
Right.
And now it is a known fact that they don't. Although some people would argue, it's like, well, what about Wiccans?
Right.
Anyway,
right.
so like there's that ongoing transformation of facts.
Right.
And then we have claims.
Which are things that we have not agreed upon to be true.
Right.
And there tends to be opinion-oriented statements like this person is beautiful and this person is not, but we all can't agree on that because that's subjective, so that's a claim. And we wanted to bring up those concepts because we want to be able to recognize them in our sources. In peer-reviewed sources, it tends to be a little safer. Mm-hmm. We can trust the facts because they've been agreed upon by a large number of people who know what they're talking about.
Right.
Any sort of source that you can find that is not peer-reviewed, and depending on, again, your professor, they might let you find any source rather than just peer-reviewed ones. Mm-hmm. You kind of got to be very careful with the things that they're presenting to you because you got to make sure that you run it through what I like to call the truthiness test. And some people call it the crap test also.
Yeah, the crap test.
Which is fun. And that's when we just recognize that the person who created this source that we found, whether or not they have any sort of biasness, whether it be political, ideological, religious, personal, whatever it is, because we all tend to be colored with biasness, and that's just how we are as humans, right?
Right.
But the more we are aware of that, the easier it will become to look at a source and say, well, you know what? I don't know if I want to really, really trust this person because they're a hard and steadfast Republican or Democrat, and
Right.
whatever they're telling me might not be super true because they want me to believe in what they believe.
Right. Yeah. And sometimes it's difficult if we've been inundated with the same ideas over and over and over. To kind of look at outside perspectives and go, well, clearly they're lying.
Right.
And it gets harder to kind of understand. It's like, well, where have you gotten your information from?
Right.
So it is very important to look at things that you may not agree with. One of the dangers of our present times is we have our Twitter, we have our Facebook, and it's very easy to turn off or ignore differing opinions.
Right.
So we just surround ourselves in an echo chamber of, right, you think this is bad? Yeah, everybody agrees. We all agree this is bad, so everybody must agree.
Right.
And then one guy comes in and goes, I don't. It's like, ignore him.
Yeah.
And then you keep echoing the same ideas, and that becomes very dangerous because nothing new is being produced. And even worse, we're ignoring other opportunities to explore these concepts and ideas.
And to grow as better people.
Right, absolutely.
And one of the most dangerous things you can do is find a source or anything that you find in your life and agree with it right away because you just want to agree with it.
Right.
It's talking about something that you believe, and it's presenting all these things that you've heard your entire life and agree with. And so you're just like, well, they must be right because they think like me.
Right.
But that's not always the case. We are humans, we are flawed, and sometimes we share information that is not exactly accurate or maybe even harmful to other people. And so we want to be very careful.
Right. I mean, there's a pretty... so people have come to understand that idea. If you give them half of what they believe in and then throw on the second half, if they agree enough with the first half, they'll believe whatever else you tell them.
Oh, yeah.
And people have come to manipulate that. And you see, several scandals on Facebook where a lot of Russian hackers decided to half impose these ideas like, oh, they're going to take away our guns, and also X factor about, some political opponent. And people were like, yeah, I believe in both of those things now. And they would share that, and it gets shared over and over.
Right.
And essentially people were controlling us by what we wanted to agree with.
Right.
And that's why peer-reviewed sources are so important. They are published sources that have been put through the test, been put through the ringer, so to say, so that the things that they put out there are at least quantifiably a fact that we can agree with.
Right. So the more we practice this academically, the more we practice in our classes evaluating sources, making sure we recognize the biasness within the sources, how to get around that, how to use it for our own perspective, the easier it'll become to do it in your everyday life and not fall for the things that people try to get you to believe on Facebook or Twitter or wherever in a very dangerous climate these days. Because you know how it's been.
Yeah, it's kind of like anybody can make a claim and everybody just runs with it as if it were a fact.
Right.
And then like 2 or 3 days later, everybody's like, yeah, it was fake the whole time.
Right.
I don't know why. And then people are like, well, I didn't believe it.
Right.
But they were the ones sharing it in the first place, and it's like, sure.
Right.
So, when we're constructing and looking for sources, it is important to kind of put them through that CRAP test. And just so that people just don't think we're just saying crap over and over, CRAP stands for currency, relevance, authority, accuracy, and purpose.
Right.
So when you find a source and you put them through these situation or these concepts, if they fail several of them, then that's when you're like, okay, this is actually funny enough crap. So
not super reliable, so maybe I shouldn't quote it.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
And that shouldn't be something that you build an entire argument off of, because if somebody goes, well, what are your sources? And you tell them, well, it's X, Y, and Z, and they go, yeah, those are known to be incredibly biased, and they're not actually trying to do anything except, sell you a product, so I don't know why you're standing on it. And that kind of topples over your whole argument in the first place.
Right. So back to the peer-reviewed sources.
Right.
We want to tell you where to find them.
Right.
And you might encounter this explanation several times in your academic career, but we just want to reiterate. So if you want to find peer-reviewed sources that you have access to easily, you can go to the UTRGV library website. And there's going to be an orange bar at the top. And the second button says Find. So if you were to click on it or hover over it for the drop-down menu, it'll tell you databases A to Z. And so you click that button, and there's going to be a lot of different options, a lot of databases. It's like a lot of Googles, but I guess from academic perspectives.
Right.
So you can play around with any sort of database, and you can figure out how to sort them by subject. There's a button at the top that'll help you do that. But two of the ones that are pretty good to stick to in the beginning of your academic career are Academic Search Complete and JSTOR. Because both of those are pretty general searches. And so if you were to click on one or the other, and I'll talk about Academic Search Complete. You'll click it and it'll open up in a new tab. And you'll see a search bar. And if you want peer-reviewed sources, you just have to scroll down a little bit. And there's a button that says scholarly, and then it says in parentheses peer-reviewed, and then sources. And so you click that button, it'll check mark it. And then once you search for something, it'll give you all the options for peer-reviewed sources. Okay, so you kind of have to play around with keywords there to find something that relates.
Right.
But it'll be the easiest way to find peer-reviewed sources that are trustworthy.
Right.
Okay.
Just a quick tip: if you've already kind of figured out your research question, one of the things you want to avoid when you're doing searches for sources is avoid trying to use your whole research question as like a search. Look at the keywords within your research question and use those as individual searches, especially when you're coming up with a topic that almost nobody is talking about because you're trying to introduce two different concepts. It's going to be worthwhile to try to research one section and then another separately, just to kind of get a gauge for what kind of conversations are going on within those fields, and then trying to figure out how you're going to combine them to create your new media.
Right. And you also want to be careful with the time period you get a source from, because even if it's peer-reviewed, knowledge changes and grows over time. Developments happen. And so you might want to limit your searches to maybe just the last 10 years or so, so you can get the most accurate information. And there's a way to do that on all your search engines underneath the database's place. You just got to kind of play around with it.
You can pick when it was published or like what. So another thing to keep in mind is it also depends on the subject. For example, if you're doing research in, say, rhetoric and composition, there's not really a limit on the time frame. Just because, it starts all the way back from like Plato and Socrates and like Freud, like there's all these different time periods that kind of have led to the development of that versus, say, something in the medical field. You're definitely going to want to do the last few years in terms of publishing. So if you're like trying to figure out, well, what are the current types of ways that people are dealing with this disease? Leeches, right? Like you don't want to go so far back. It's like, bloodletting. Just slit your wrists a little bit, let yourself bleed out a little bit, and you're good to go. Eat a cookie, you're fine, right?
You got ghosts in your blood.
So you're gonna want to, depending on the topic, limit the time frame of these published articles.
Right.
Versus, say, like you're doing a historical approach, then you would be like, let me see what it was like from the beginning, the middle, and the end now, where we're at. That would be relevant. But if you're talking about some things like, technology in the classroom, that's definitely more of a recent phenomenon than, say, like from 40 years ago.
Right. And then we kind of want to emphasize that you do need to cite and use these sources correctly. If you're going to copy and paste any thought from a source, you need to quote it. And depending on your professor and your situation, it's going to be different formats. I tend to stick it to MLA. Some people like APA, Chicago, whatever it may be. Just ask your professor.
Right.
But you do need to give credit to these sources because we don't want to plagiarize. First of all, big consequences of plagiarism in this university. You could fail the class, you could fail the project, or you could fail out of the university.
Right.
Depending on the situation. So be very careful. Two, and the most important one, I think, is that ideas in the academic community are gold. They are very important. And so we don't want to steal any other's ideas, just like we don't want our ideas to be stolen. So if you were to be published, somebody would have to give you credit, and so you have to do the same favor to anybody else.
Right.
Okay? So make sure you quote, and make sure you do it in the correct format.
Right. And if you have questions about format, that would be something you want to direct towards your professors.
Right.
In English, we tend to stick to the MLA format, and there's a way of doing in-text citations and what the works cited page looks like at the end. Just ask us. Part of our job, introducing you to academic writing is showing you how to give credit where credit is due,
Right.
so that we can avoid situations where you end up being punished for a simple forgetting to just add the author's last name.
Right. And we want to make these good habits happen early.
Yeah, exactly. So take this class as an opportunity to ask those questions now.
Right. All right. I think that wraps it up for this one. So just to reiterate, you find sources by being very careful with the information you find. Make sure it's peer-reviewed if you can. If not, run it through the crab test. Make sure you cite them correctly. And just be very careful with all the information you get inundated with. Make sure it's as close to the truth and close to fact as possible. All right?
All right. Thank you. And as always, send us an email. You got questions about formatting or whatever it might be, ask your professors too.
Yep.
All right. Thank you, guys. Bye.
Thanks.
Hi, this is Thomas. We're back here with Cyndy and Carl. Carl, you are a librarian here at UTRGV?
That is correct. I am an instructional and research librarian.
Okay.
Nice.
So this podcast is focusing on our students and things that they will inevitably encounter while they're here. Obviously, one of the things that they will encounter is research and then having to go to the library for something outside of just napping.
One hopes.
Yeah, one would hope. At least that's what I tell them to try not to do as much.
Yeah.
So from your perspective, what's something you wanted to share with them?
Just realize, and I think that this is very important, research isn't going out and finding an article that directly answers your question.
Right.
In fact, in very few cases is that actually going to happen.
Right.
What research is going out and finding a bunch of different sources that may answer one part of your question. And then it's up to you as the researcher to synthesize all that information. In some cases it may be very it may be very different stuff to where you're going to have to Frankenstein it together. But, that's, I think, one of the most important things to remember is that you may only be able to answer your question in part, not like the whole, or I should say in parts, not the whole thing all at once.
Right.
I would say, sorry to interrupt, I would say that if you do find the whole answer, then it's like, well, you have to pick a different research question because that's been done, or at least so the reason I mentioned that is because a lot of students struggle with the idea of pulling away from, well, I got this answer, so that must be it. And they, even though we tell them, it's like, do you completely agree? And it's like, no, but it got answered. So
that's not necessarily it. I don't know how to put it. That's not necessarily the case either. Just because one person has an answer to your question doesn't mean another researcher, somewhere down the line hasn't come up with a different answer.
Right.
I mean, look at what's happening with eggs. They're good, they're bad, they're good, they're bad, they're good,
only
they're
the
bad.
white or only the yellow.
Exactly. So,
I just realized it. Damn it.
I had to.
Exactly.
I had to.
All right,
So-
good night, everybody.
Thanks for listening.
So I think the thing with research is remembering that it is a process and it's something that's going to take a little bit of time. It isn't something that's going to necessarily be, boom, you're done.
Right.
You can get on to writing the paper. In fact, your research may lead you to rethink your initial position with your paper.
Right. I would hope that would make research a little more engaging for everyone, like knowing that the answer is not going to be as clear cut, so it requires a little bit more curiosity, a little bit more exploration, and helps you stumble upon information that you may not have considered before. So I think that I would find that more engaging than just straight up getting my answer to a question that's already been answered several times over and just repeating that same information in slightly different wording. Because I think that's what also students might have encountered before in their previous experiences. Just like, say this thing, just reorder it so you won't plagiarize.
Right.
Right, and maybe we want to get them to move a little bit beyond that.
Yeah.
To critical thinking
Right,
about what it is they're researching.
Right.
I think there's this fear of like, well, I went out, I had this research question, and I found some answers, but I ended up with more questions than answers, and I sometimes, I'm very proud of that moment, and I go, so what do you want to do now? What do you think? And they're like, well, I'll change my research question. I'm like, no, don't do that. Having more questions doesn't mean you did something wrong. If anything, that means you're heading into a good direction where if somebody were to read your work, they go, well, I don't know what to do research on. I am interested in this. And then I can hand them your paper and go, oh my God, this guy had a lot of great questions. I think I will focus on X, and then move on from there.
Right.
This is what I found. But in my research, or in the research, there's also these questions.
Right.
And I really wish that more researchers would talk about that within their articles, papers, studies. I think a lot of people within the quote-unquote academy just want to present their answer and don't talk about its implications or any questions that their research or methodology may have raised during the course of their investigation, the process of their investigation.
Right.
Yeah, I would love that, because then the students would really see that it is a process and not just this beautiful thing comes out of my mind in the perfect form in one draft, and here it is, and you should be like me, otherwise you're not as good as me, right? I feel like getting a little peek behind that process would be good for our students.
Yeah.
Have you guys ever thought about actually bringing in an actual researcher to talk about what they do to your class?
Oh, I would love to do that.
Right. That definitely would be something, and I maybe we could even have the podcast record it. Just because I think a lot of students benefit even from these conversations of behind the scenes of like what it means for us to teach writing, or like what it means to talk to a librarian, like what kind of specialties they have, because maybe they have this one-dimensional version of, well, librarian is somebody who helps me find books, but in our situation, and especially with all the conversations I've had with you, Carl, and all the other librarians, it's no, there's like worlds and worlds and worlds hidden, or not hidden, but like just right there on the surface waiting to be accessed. And I think a lot of students have this hesitation. So what would you advise to students who are like hesitant? Like if we were to tell them, go to the library, what kind of advice would you give them to be like, come talk to us?
I think that's just it. Just come and talk to us. And it doesn't necessarily have to be about, well, where do I find this particular piece of information? You can come and talk to us about, well, how should I look at this particular piece of information? Because, I mean, there's whole, genres of research theory out there. There's whole different ways to do research, whether it's, postmodern, whether you want to go back to some of the greats like Marx, or feminist theory or new feminist theory. And librarians can kind of help you figure out exactly how you want to explore a topic.
Right. I think that's kind of an amazing thing to really bring up, because it is, I think students, especially when they've had specific training in certain classes, they think, well, I should only think of research as X, Y, and Z, or even worse, X. And it is this very big world of how you can interpret things, and I think librarians are a really excellent source in trying to figure out, well, what other ways can I look at this one topic?
Right.
Yeah, and also talking, I think, to other experts helps as well. I mean, whether it's going and talking to somebody in the political science department, or somebody in economics, or somebody in computer science, depending on what you're looking at. I mean, even looking at something like, let's say, just off the top of my head, like anime,
Right.
for example, you can go look at the politics of it. You can go look at the cultural part. There's also the economics. There's the history. There's just so much stuff. And when you get into these little sections, it really invigorates your research, I think. You know, just when you learn these neat little facts, neat little things, it's like one of the biggest anime import/production companies here in the United States was actually started over in Houston, called AD Vision, you know, and they brought over a lot of stuff during the 90s. You know, one of the first comic book companies in the United States that started doing manga-esque stuff was Anarchic Press, which is based out of San Antonio. You know, so there's all these, you know, interesting facts out there. It's just a matter of exploring these different avenues.
Right.
I know I've had students who, like, they come into my office, they see the stuff that I have in here, and they go, oh, you like this, you like that? And I go, yeah, and, you know, I'll mention some fun fact, and they'll look at me just flabbergasted, like I just blew their whole mind. And I was like, man, if you think that's interesting, like, you need to go to the library and just chat up some people, because that's like the bare minimum information I have. You can imagine that there's somebody who's the perfect expert to talk to.
Right. And the library is kind of like the hub of the entire university, because you have your hand in all kinds of information, and I'm sure you have connections with all sorts of different departments, different colleges. So even if they want to, like, I need to interview somebody who knows something about this, who works in it, you probably have that information. Like, go point them to this direction, this building, go talk to this person. Yeah. And I think that's really helpful, and I would like them to realize that more. That's not just a place where the books sleep, and they sleep.
Beanbags.
Well, not anymore.
No? They're gone?
Most of them.
Oh, no.
Most of them have been killed. We actually have our beanbag morgue upstairs on the 4th floor where we take all the dead ones.
No.
The
They've
beanbag.
been killed by students.
Oh, no.
This is why we can't have nice things.
Oh, Lord.
Oh, no. But yeah, I remember we went to a training recently, a few weeks ago, and we walked out, we were chatting about stuff, and we were passing by other people, and you're like, oh, hey, doctor, and like, you were just saying hi to everybody, and I was like, I'm lucky I know, like, everybody in my department, let alone, like, all these people you're talking to, and I was like, this is the type of person you want to get. So when we talk about networking opportunities in class, you're exactly the type of person to know, because who else knows anybody at this, you know, university better than the librarian who gets everybody students?
Yeah, we're a hub.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, and besides being a place to network, and of course a place where information is stored, the library is also a place now where we can help you interpret the information that you find, I guess would be the best way to put it.
Right.
And also, you know, kind of help you evaluate the information as well. I think that's an important aspect that we as librarians and instructors don't really talk about a great deal, is the fact that we don't teach how to evaluate information.
Right.
Yeah.
I think a lot of students just want to, like, well, I found all this information, so I have to use all of it. And it's like, really not the most helpful situation to happen. So.
Right.
No.
Hi, Carl.
Hi. How's
So-
it going?
It goes.
Awesome.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, not
No
at all.
problem.
Joining us for this podcast is Amy Becker-Chambless, Dr. Amy Becker-Chambless. So she might intermittently talk to us about. We were currently having a podcast with Carl, talking to him about library resources, things like that. So anything you want to mention or ask, make sure to jump in.
Okay, thank you.
So we were talking about evaluating sources or evaluating information. Is there anything else some struggles that you see students have that are very common? Something that you see and you're like, we can help you do that.
Basically understand the differences between different types of materials. Understand that there's different types of voices and how to figure out whether or not those voices are actually legitimate sources of information.
Right.
You know, I hate to keep bringing on that point, but I think we live in such an confused environment information-wise.
Right.
Means that a lot of students, you know, there's so much out there, there's so much constantly being produced, you know, there's so many various voices that students don't know how to understand what they're reading or listening to or watching.
Right. They're oversaturated with information.
Right.
Like, there's just so much going out there. There's so many people with so many different angles, with so many different purposes, and I think that's definitely something that we try to tell them is when you're reading or you're looking up this information, you have to be aware of the authority behind it and whether that authority really does have that kind of authority in the topic that they're looking at.
Yeah.
And nowadays you even have to now worry about, you know, what's coming out of academia or the academy. Joe Rogan did a podcast with these two guys who worked with a professor over in England. And what they did was they flooded the academy with a bunch of bogus studies, articles, papers, you know, just to see if they could get them published. And they got them published.
Right, yeah.
Even though, you know, they're with the peer review process, which is where professors go over other academics' materials, they still were able to get this stuff through.
Right. Because I believe there's a lot of for-profit journals out there now, right? Like you pay to get published, essentially.
Yeah. Well, there's not just for-profits, but there's unfortunately an instance in the academy where people are, instead of looking at the information objectively, they're trying to, I don't know how to put it, they're trying to put forward a particular philosophy, so they're willing to forego a stringent peer-reviewed process in order to basically uplift a particular ideology.
Right.
That's, I guess, the best way to put it.
They're allowing for their bias to, if infect the peer review process.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, hearing that, I think a lot of students would be like, "Well, then who do we trust?" So, how do we handle a situation where a student might hear what you just said and they go, "So I shouldn't go to the library or talk to academics?"
Well, no, you should talk to academics. You know, one of the ways you can deal with this information confusing is do your due diligence.
Right.
If you find an article you like, but you're unsure of its provenance, you can look up the author. You can see if there's any other materials written by the author. You can look for other voices within that particular subject or argument to see what other people are saying. You know, there's ways to do this. You just need to practice them. Or, you know, if you're unsure of what to do with a specific piece of information, go to the library and talk to a librarian. Or go to your professor or instructor, and, you know, hopefully they will be willing to take the time to help you out.
Right.
Of course, we will.
Yes.
It's one of the things we've been trying to promote, even with this podcast. Like, I described this to students as the type of thing where we talk to you with the concerns that we have for you, and that's one of the reasons why we reach out to as many people as possible is because we want to be there, and as much as the library wants to be there, and that's one of the reasons why when you signed up, we're like, let's get Carl.
Yeah. Would you say the library databases are a little safer to use?
Again, I just saw the Joe Rogan podcast maybe about a month ago. And I would have said, yeah, they're fine and everything's cool and you can use databases from the library with pretty much an assurance that there's not going to be a problem with your information. Now Not so much so. Like I said, you got to do your due diligence.
That's
You
good.
got to look up the authors. You got to look at all the different voices within a particular argument. You know, it
The
like I
historical
said,
context.
the historical context. Like I said, the information environment we're living in is so absolutely crazy.
Right. I
You
guess that
know-
accessibility is beautiful because, people have easier access to information nowadays that they maybe wouldn't have before, but then that's that whole double-edged sword thing. Like, everybody's got it, but everybody's got it, and they can contribute to it in any way that they
Or
see
misinterpret
fit. Yes,
it, or
exactly.
reframe it, or
Exactly.
yeah.
So, just that vigilance is needed.
I think
it's
in all
tough.
things.
Yeah, it's tough, but it gets easier with practice, right? Like, it'll get easier to figure out, like, who wrote this and figure out what their information
Right.
and make sure to look at the dates and everything. And I think that it just takes practice.
All right. I think that's one of the reasons why I always tell students when they do research, if you come across a source that disagrees with you, don't just dismiss it. Right? Don't necessarily take it its word for everything, but and look at why it's there. Like, why would somebody disagree about this topic? And then kind of look at the conversations going on around that paper, and you might find that this very one-sided thing that you thought was for sure X might be a little bit of Y, and it might be a little bit of Z, and it might be all these other letters and even numbers. Who knows? But and including that in your research kind of shows that you're trying to do that due diligence of, like, I'm not coming in just one-sided. This is what I believe. You're looking at everything and still going, here's my conclusion of all of this information.
Right.
Even if the conclusion again goes back to just being another question of, like, if we were to continue doing this research, it might be important to look at blank and evaluate this.
Right.
So,
Well, cool.
all right. So we like to leave the last few minutes of the podcast with any final thoughts from you. For our students, any words of encouragement, anything that you'd like to leave off with for them to have.
Please use the library, use our resources, talk to librarians. We're here to basically help you guys with your research, not write your papers. we're here to help you find materials. We're here to answer any questions you may have about citing, maybe talk to you about your research to help you come to some conclusions. But we're a resource that surprisingly is not that well used. And we should be used because we're an integral part of what the university does, which is research.
Right.
Right.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
All
Thank you,
right.
Carl.
Thank you,
Amy.
Carl. Thank you, Amy, for joining us midway through. Appreciate that. All right, guys, that'll be it for today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks.